Hello and welcome. My name is Graeme Hoppitt and I welcome you to the 21st episode of the Addiction Free Naturally podcast. So welcome wherever you are in the world. Today I'm going to answer a question, which is why I stopped attending 12-step meetings. 12-step meetings are probably the bedrock of addiction recovery around the world. They've been going since 1938. They were actually started for AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the founder, Bill Wilson, really started them as his way out of his drinking addiction. And I went to meetings for years. Years. So I originally traveled 5 hours, a round trip, 5 hours to get to meetings. So I was seriously committed at that stage to meetings. That was, and I'd probably done that for around 15 months, maybe 18 months. I can't remember the exact timescale now. And then I moved and I started to go to 2 meetings a week because they were nearer, and that was probably an hour each way. So at the time, I was doing 2 meetings a week, 2 hours just to get round trip, just to get to meetings. So, I'd at least reduced my time from 5 hours traveling to a meeting to 2 hours each meeting. So I'd done either 1 or 2 meetings a week, 1 meeting a week, certainly for the first 15, 16, maybe 18 months, and then 2 meetings a week. So I'm not just giving my reasons why I stopped having, I've been to like 1 or 2 meetings and stopped. No, I was committed for several years going to either 1 or 2 meetings a week. And I'm going to give you the reasons why I stopped in a minute. What I do want to say is the positive for me about the meetings was community. It gave me a sense of camaraderie, or certainly in those early days, I felt that I wasn't alone. So I was grateful to know I wasn't alone, grateful to initially be amongst other people who were also addicted. But however, my overall conclusion, having attended meetings for years, was they didn't actually serve me and they didn't make me feel better. In fact, my situation, in my opinion, got worse. And that's why I stopped. I come across some information that set me on a new path. So these are the specific reasons, though, why I stopped going to meetings. I feel that we don't know what we don't know. So, we only know what we know. So when I first looked up how to overcome addiction, I saw 12-step meetings and looked for my nearest meeting. And that's how I started, because I didn't know there was any other way. So the only thing I could find out was about 12-step meetings that, went back to the original AA philosophy, started in 1938. So, like over 80 years ago. But in that time, so much has changed. So we don't know what we don't know. And that's a key starting point. Now, for me, the reasons I stopped were, first of all, there are alarming statistics about the success of the 12-step program. Now, there's no actual written down statistics. And this is part of the dilemma, I feel. Certainly in, some people have researched this, and certainly in a book, Debunk the Sober Truth, Debunking the Bad Science Behind the 12 Steps. They've done a lot of research and they come up with various statistics, and some of them are actually from AA specifically, but we're, all of the 12 steps use the same philosophy. And, AA give their results as something like, in their own internal survey, and this was back a few years, I've got to grant you. The only information I could find goes back to 2008. But at that stage, 33% of members said that they'd been sober for more than a decade. 12% claimed sobriety for 5 to 10 years. 24% were sober for 1 to 5 years. And 31% were sober for under a year. Now, of course, these don't take into account the large number of alcoholics, because these stats are from AA, who never made it through their first year of meetings. And, AA is saying completing the 12 steps for a period of time is required for success anyway. So that's AA's own standards. Now, in the book, The Sober Truth, they done further research and they couldn't find any success greater than 5 to 10%. About 1 in every 15 people, they said, who enters a program is able to stay sober. So that's alarming, isn't it? I mean, that if it's 5 to 10%, that is worse than probably any medical result. So, like, if you were taking some drug to overcome something else, if you only had a 5 or 10%, you'd think that's pretty appalling, wouldn't you? So therefore, that's the first alarming thing that sort of shook me. I'm going to meetings, but the success of these meetings was alarming. And in fact, if I took the percentages of people in the meetings that I went to, then I would say the percentages were worse than 5%. People were slipping, relapsing all the time. So I saw no evidence of sustained sobriety, and sobriety being the term of keeping yourself clean of whatever your drug of choice is. So the statistics themselves were alarming. What for me now, when I looking back, and was the first thing that started to hit me, was we are reinforcing our identity by going to meetings. You're going to a meeting and say, I'm Joe, I'm a compulsive gambler, I'm Sarah, I'm a sex addict, I'm Felissa, I'm an alcoholic. So we're going along reinforcing our identity. And in everything that I've learned since, that goes against all of that research and knowledge that I have gained. Now, I'm not saying I know everything, because clearly I don't. That's the thing. None of us know everything. We don't know what we don't know. But what I fervently believe now is going to a meeting and saying you're an addict is reinforcing your identity. And that's why you stay stuck. That's why you have to keep going back to meetings week in, week out, year in, year out, decade in, decade out. So it's like the only way to stay sober in a 12-step meeting is to keep going back. I'm suggesting there's far better ways. So yeah, in summary, what I'm saying is going to a meeting is reinforcing your identity as an addict. You're telling yourself you're an addict, you're staying in that place. And I've used the quote many times by one of my mentors, Marissa Peer. The words that we say to ourselves and the pictures that we hold in our mind are creating our reality. So if you're telling yourself you're an addict, if you're maintaining those pictures in your mind of you being addicted to gambling, to sex, to food, to gaming, to drink, to drugs, whatever it may be, you are reinforcing that. And that is why you're still stuck in addiction. I was talking to a guy from America today. He's a gambler. And, it's just exchanging a few comments in text at this stage. I'm going to talk to him very soon. But he was sort of saying, I've been stuck in gambling for like 20 plus years. And he's the same age as me, so I could identify with him. And he feels he's completely stuck. He's been doing the meetings for 20 years, and he's still addicted. He still can't break this addiction, this habit, this learned process of gambling for him. And I would say that's entirely because not entirely, so that is because one part of it is he's reinforcing his identity, and he hasn't learned the tools within the process to enable him to get out, because there's no science involved in it. And as my from one of my favorite books, Maxwell Maltz, you can never outperform your own self-image. And you've got to look at your self-image, and if you're going to meetings reinforcing that, that's not helping. So that was another reason that I got out. So reinforcing your subconscious identity is keeping you stuck as an addict. That's no good. You've got to create that new identity of being a non-gamer, a non-gambler, a non-drinker, a non-sex addict. Another thing that I don't like about the 12 steps, again, is one of my reasons why ultimately I got out, is it's creating dependency. You're only going to stay sober of your drug of choice, whether that's a substance or a behavior, by going to meetings every week. I mean, some people go every day, and I find it quite alarming when I read comments, because I'm in many addiction groups where people say, I've been sober for 16 years, but I have to go to meetings 3 times a week or whatever they go. I saw a comment by a guy a couple of days ago. He said, I felt the urges, so I went to 5 meetings today. 5 meetings. So that means for 5 hours of his day, he spent in meetings as a way of, moving away from that urge. Yes, we have to find ways of moving away from the urge, but spending 5 hours in a meeting, in my opinion, is not good use of your time. Isn't it better to learn techniques where you can move your attention away from your urges wherever you are? So you just learn it once. When I say learn it once, it's obviously a process. You need to learn it, repeat, repetition. That's how we learn things. But going to multiple meetings as a way of staying clean, that's dependency. That's an addiction in itself. That's a learned behavior. So that's another reason why I chose to leave 12-step meetings behind. Another thing wasn't a massive one for me, but it is very confusing, and that's religion. I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. I've got nothing against people who are religious. That is your choice, as same as my choice is to be spiritual rather than religious. Religion was pushed onto me by my mother, and I guess I held on to it for many years. So becoming spiritual was a journey. So going to 12-step meetings and being told that, it's only by believing in your God or your higher power, that can be confusing for many people. And I see that comments many times that, people often can't relate to that. The ones that can do, and that's fine. And that's why, again, we've got to find a methodology that works for us. But religion or a religious scripture within a 12-step movement shouldn't be the only way you can become sober. And my question would be, if religion was the answer, why are so many religious people addicts? So find your own route, but that is another reason I found it confusing. It wasn't a major one for me. The ones I've mentioned were much bigger. One of the things I really dislike about the 12 steps is it provides no alternatives, and it doesn't allow you to consider alternatives. It is our way or the highway is what they're saying. They don't consider alternatives. They certainly don't consider science or anything like that. And I often get into debates with 12-step members where they will only accept these scriptures which are over 80 years old. So the fact there's no alternatives, I believe, keeps them stuck. Exactly as this guy that I, were messaging today, where he's saying, I've been going to meetings for like 20 years. He's still going to meetings after 20 years. And his actual words were, the elders, he called them elders, they don't like it when anyone asks questions about are there alternatives. There are alternatives. And I believe that everything should be able to work together alongside. I'm not saying don't go to meetings. If you want the camaraderie, then that's fine. But I personally believe going to meetings will keep you stuck because of the reasons I've mentioned about keeping you in that identity of being an addict. But the fact they don't allow alternatives, the fact they don't allow, that sort of discussion, that's worrying. That infers to me that they haven't got confidence in their own process, especially when there's no evidence of high success rates. And one of the biggest for me is the 12 steps totally ignore science. Obviously, this is linked to the fact they don't like any alternatives, but there's so many sciences now. Obviously, I'm a hypnotherapist, so I am I'm biased towards the process I learned, but I'm also a qualified theta healer as well. It just so happens I don't practice that anymore. I've decided to go with hypnotherapy, but both theta healing and hypnotherapy, from my own experiences, have had major impact on myself as an addict and other people. So we shouldn't dismiss that. The 12 steps shouldn't dismiss the sciences and other things around, there are many impacts from ignoring it. It keeps you stuck. If you're going to ignore the benefits that we're seeing in the world, it's going to keep you stuck in addiction. I love, when I'm saying they ignore science, they ignore all these great leaders or teachers such as Dr. Mate Gabor. And I'm going to read this because I want you to hear his actual quote. Dr. Mate Gabor sums it up, in my opinion, really well. He says, addiction is not a choice that no one makes. It's not a moral failure. It's not an ethical lapse. It's not a weakness of character. It's not a failure of will, which is how our society depicts addiction, nor is it an inherent brain disease, which is how the medical tendency is to see it, but it's actually a response to human suffering. And when I started to learn this sort of material from Dr. Mate Gabor and others, that's what opened my eyes. Because what he's saying here is in direct conflict with the 12 steps. He's showing you that we're not bad people. We are in a position where we are covering up. We're using our addiction as a way of covering up some other pain. And that's what I love about Dr. Mate Gabor. He's got loads of experience. He's helped addicts. And he's giving you reasons why we're not bad people and why it's not a moral failure and why society is depicting addicts so badly. We can, we need to look at alternatives. We don't know. When I read that quote originally, I thought this is a classic example. We don't know what we don't know. And when I see that, where he's saying it's not a disease because the 12-step model is working on a disease philosophy, then it gives you possibilities. It opens up different possibilities. What I say is take the bits that work from you from the 12 steps. I'm not saying dismiss it all. But community can be found in other places. So again, that's why I stopped the 12-step meetings. In the time since the 12 steps meetings were first introduced in 1938, over 80 years ago, we put a man on the moon. Doesn't that show how the world has changed? Yet, some people are hanging on to the 12 steps. And so it's the only way. It's the only way. If the person who invented space travel, and we're just about to go into commercial space travel now, remember, we wouldn't have made any progress, but we're still hanging on to the 12 steps. Can you not see the absurdity of that? Don't you feel that some things must have changed, but we're still using the same book, the same words to overcome addiction when the world has changed so much in so many ways? That in itself should surely beg the question, well, isn't there a different way or something we can add in to our way to overcome addiction? Another example is we've created the internet since the time that the 12 steps come on board. So there's been massive changes around the world, but we're still hanging on to the 12-step philosophy. We shouldn't do that at the exclusion of all the wonderful alternatives out there. Sure, use it if it helps you, but be aware of all the incredible advances in science of neuroplasticity, etc. My question for you is then, why is the success rate so low in the 12 steps, and why do people go through rehab multiple times? Why do they slip? Why do they have relapses? If the 12-step works so well, why are so many people relapsing? That would be my question for you. There are many alternatives. So, as I said, I'm not saying dismiss the 12 steps just because you've chosen not to go to meetings. I'm not saying you shouldn't use the 12-step philosophy in some way. I'm just saying look at alternatives as well, because you could maybe use both of them. I used my time more productively. I started to learn about how the brain works. Instead of traveling in the original days, as I said, it was a round trip 5 hours. And then in the latter stages, I was going to 2 meetings with an hour each way. So that's 2 hours or 4 hours a week I was traveling just to meetings. you can use that time so much more productively to use scientifically proven techniques to move your attention and to become sober of your drug of choice, whether that's a substance, drink, drugs, or a behavior such as sex or gambling, whatever. The solution has to be to promote our mental health and really reverse the root cause of what has got us into addiction in the first place. As Dr. Matagabe said so well, we are using addiction to cover up some pain, to find the solution by using the time more productively. One of the great advances since 1938, when the 12 steps come in, is neuroplasticity. It shows us that our brains are not fixed. Instead, they're like plastic. They can be changed and molded. So you can create new neural pathways in your brain as a non-drinker, a non-drug taker, a non-gambler, a non-sex addict. So it can be done, but you need to embrace all this science, all this technology, all of these wonderful modalities such as theta healing or tapping or hypnotherapy. And there's loads of them. There's literally hundreds of different modalities that could maybe help you. You have to choose the one that works best for you or that you feel more aligned to. Remember, one of the things that I use is the be, do, have model. We've got to be that person in our mind. And again, this links directly to why I stopped going to meetings, because the meetings were telling me, you're an addict, you're always going to be an addict, you've got to come to meetings for the rest of your life. Yeah, you're reinforcing that identity. Whereas the be, do, have model is being that person in my head first of being an ex-addict. So I'm no longer an addict. So I've created that identity. I'm being that ex-addict in my mind. I'm now doing the behaviors that someone who didn't have an addictive personality, who didn't have an addiction, would do. So I get the outcomes of the freedom of being a normal person, for want of a better term, whatever normal might be in this society. Yeah, so I'm asking the question, who must I be? What must I do so that I can have my freedom back? So this is what I use, and this was a much more productive use of my time, because I learned methodologies, I learned techniques that I could use to move my attention away from the urges. The more we master ourselves, the more we master our thoughts. And remember, we're not our thoughts. We're the thinker of our thoughts. So when we start to master our thoughts and be able to move our attention away from urges, we start to create that freedom in our lives. You really have got to focus on your subconscious identity, your self-image, who you really think of yourself. And if you're going to meetings saying, I am an addict, I'm a sex addict, I'm a drug addict, I'm a compulsive gambler, you're reinforcing that self-image. You have to create the new identity and reinforce a new identity, not the old identity. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck in the old identity. So the answer is to create that new self-image as a non-addict. And I don't believe that the 12 steps is supporting you in doing that. So that's why I left. I left because of the reasons I've now summarized here. The camaraderie was the big plus for me in the meetings initially. It showed me I wasn't alone. And I'd done them for several years. But it wasn't until I left, it wasn't until I opened my mind to other opportunities, to other methods of recovery, because I thought the only way was the 12 steps. I originally believed it was a disease. I had a disease and I would have it forever. I originally believed once an addict, always an addict. I no longer believe any of that. I don't believe it's a disease. The same as Dr. Matagabe saying, it's not a disease of the mind. It is a response to some pain in our lives. So I no longer believe it is a disease. I no longer believe once an addict, always an addict. So I changed my beliefs. And as a consequence of that, I started to see new opportunities come my way. I started to see therapies that helped me. And then the more I got into it, I started to understand how my mind worked and how I could start to create the life I really wanted. So that is, in a summary, the reasons I left the 12-step meetings. I respect and acknowledge everyone's opinions. So, if it's for you, so be it. I respect and acknowledge your journey. And equally, I respect and acknowledge that for me, because I respect myself, that this is the way that has worked for me. This is what gets results for my clients. So that is why I am no longer an advocate of the 12-step meetings. I believe there are stronger ways. There are ways that will not only allow you to escape your addiction, but to change your life positively. Anyway, I hope by answering that question, you can understand my logic, at least why I left the 12-step meetings, and at least maybe it will at least give you the opportunity to go and explore deeper. As I said, don't follow my lead just for the sake of following my lead, but do research, go deeper, dig deeper than the 12 steps, see what else is out there that may help you overcome your addiction, because addiction is a killer. It literally destroys your life. It sucks the life out of you. And that's not going to help you or those around you. When you start to resolve the issues that are keeping you stuck in addiction, you start to turn up differently in life for yourself and for those around you. They'll start to see you differently because you have a freedom around you. You have a sense of calm and ease that you don't have when you're stuck in addiction, because the anxiety and depression for many people when they're addicts is running very high. So look at your alternatives. That's all I say to you. Don't accept there's only one way, which is the mantra really of the 12 steps. That isn't true. There is more than one way to overcome addiction. So I would encourage you to look at alternatives to the 12 steps. And if I can help you, reach out. You can get me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, or email me at graemehoppitt.com. So email me at graemehoppitt@graemehoppitt.com, and I can help you with one-to-one coaching, or at least answer some questions. But don't accept there is only one way. There's always more than one way. So I'm wishing you a great day. Thank you for joining me on this 21st episode of the Addiction Free Naturally podcast.